It's a very great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Peter Stallybrass. Professor Stallybrass is the Annenberg Professor in the Humanities and Professor of English and Comparative Literature at the University of Pennsylvania, where he directs the weekly seminar on the history of material texts. He teaches courses on print culture, Shakespeare, Renaissance studies, and the history of the book, among others. I, like many others in early modern studies and literary studies more generally, have been reading his work with great profit since the publication of the Politics and Poetics of Transgression in 1986. Since then, he has written influential works on an enormous range of subjects, including literary and cultural theory, clothing in the Renaissance, textual editing, Benjamin Franklin, stage transvestitism, material culture, and the history of the book. His books include Subject and Object in Renaissance Culture, co-edited with Margrethe de Grazia and Maureen Quilligan in 1996, and Language Machines, Technologies of Literary and Cultural Production, co-edited with Jeffrey Maston and Nancy Vickers in 1997, and Renaissance Clothing and the Materials of Memory, co-authored with Anne Rosalind Jones in 2000. Most recently, an essay co-authored with Zachary Lesser appeared in Shakespeare Quarterly on the first quarto of Hamlet as Shakespeare's first literary drama. Professor Stallybrass's work is always thoughtful, provocative, witty, and engaging, and I've learned a great deal from it throughout my time in the profession. His talk today is on The Book is Computer. Please join me in welcoming Peter Stallybrass.
Thanks very much, Ed, and many thanks to David Miller for the kind invitation, and it's very nice to be here. So this is a talk in 3 parts, and the first is about scrolls and books. So the book as computers, you'll see, is a sort of, it's there, but in rather than a distant way. One thing I should explain at the beginning is when I talk about the Codex, I mean the book. For the purposes of this lecture, Codex, often defined as a manuscript book, just means a book. So the first section is called Scrolls and Books. There was an extraordinary resurgence of the scroll as a technology in the 20th century. Films, video cassettes, audio tapes, microfilms, carousels are all scroll technologies. And as they were incorporated into new academic disciplines, film studies, music, the history of art, they brought with them a specific problem characteristic of scrolls. While a scroll is an excellent form for continuous narrative, it's extremely difficult to use if you want to move rapidly between discontinuous passages, as one normally does when teaching film or music. Film and music as modern academic disciplines were thus bedeviled by the constraints of scroll technology. It was the desire to do with film or music what you could do so easily with literature in the form of a book that led to the urgent search for new technologies, using lasers, for instance, to replace the scroll in film and music. This is all the stranger when so many people have been concerned about the death of the book. For in many ways, it is the book form, the combination of the ability to scroll with the capacity for random access, enabling you to leap from place to place, that has provided the model that these other cultural technologies now seek to emulate. Computers, for instance, with their extraordinary powers of random access, have been, at least until recently, for most people, extremely ungainly and unwieldy in their scroll functions, although this is changing, I think. Until recently, how many people had actually read a lengthy narrative on a computer? But computers take to a new level a crucial aspect of the way in which we often use books, our ability through bookmarks to have our fingers in many different places at the same time and to move rapidly from one place to another. In this sense, books are more like computers than they are like scrolls. We are, I believe, reliving in a different key the moment analyzed by Robertson Skeet in The Birth of the Codex, when reading practices were radically transformed. If cultural pessimists claim that no one reads anymore, perhaps they mean that it's becoming less common for people to submit themselves to the scroll function of books. Surfing on TV works against the unwinding of a film scroll, and hypertext works against a continuous reading of the Canterbury Tales. But that has nothing to do with the death of the book. On the contrary, I would argue that we are living with a new intensity, the triumph of the book as a technology. For in a book, as opposed to a scroll, one does not need to read from page 1 to page 2 to page 3, and so on. One can read from page 180 to page 36 to page 297, as, say, in a collection of poems, or for that matter, in a Catholic breviary. Or now, with the aid of hypertext, one can thicken a specific moment, reading versions of a single line of verse as it moves from manuscript to manuscript, from manuscript to magazine, from magazine to pamphlet, from pamphlet to collected works. And the second section is called the materiality of reading, or how many fingers does it take to read a book? Scrolls, whether film reels, video cassettes, audio tapes, or classical rolls, made it hard or impossible to jump from place to place rapidly. They don't give much play to the index finger. The scroll is a technology that depends upon a literal unwinding in which the physical proximity of one moment in the narrative to another is both materially and symbolically significant. One cannot move easily back and forth between distant points on a scroll. It's precisely such movement back and forth that the Codex permits. The Codex, in other words, elicits specific kinds of handwork. Let me propose then two bald and overstated hypotheses. One, the history of the hand in relation to the Codex is the history of the index in the multiple senses of that word, which I'll try to explain. Secondly, the history of the Codex, as opposed to the scroll, is the history of the bookmark. The Codex encourages discontinuous reading. The fingers are themselves crucial forms of bookmarks, but they can be replaced by prosthetic fingers, pieces of paper or parchment, ribbons of linen or silk, pressed flowers, tabs or baubles glued to the book itself. To take the first point, what does it mean to say that the history of the Codex is the history of the index? The term index itself is both related to the hand and to specific functions that the hand can be made to do. In relation to the Codex, the index means, first of all, the forefinger, so-called, this finger, so-called because it's used in pointing. Secondly, it can mean a piece of wood or metal used as a pointer for reading. This is a yad used in the synagogue for reading the Torah. But it has a long history in many other places too. Thirdly, the index can mean a table of contents prefixed to a book or a list or summary. In this sense, so it's interesting that this is a historical change, that often prefixes are at the beginning of books. In this sense, Iago speaks to Desdemona's use of her hands as, quote, an index and obscure prologue to the history of lust. An index and obscure prologue, so that there's the index at the beginning of the book. Fourthly, an index can be an alphabetical list placed usually at the end of a book of the names, subjects, etc. occurring within it, with the indications of the passages where they occur. Fifthly, in the Renaissance, it came to mean the list of books that the Roman Catholics are forbidden to read. And the index, one of the interesting things about the index, it both is an index of books, but it often worked, as here, through the index. How the Catholic index worked, they worked here, they're looking for, there are 3 poems censored by Petrarch, and they would turn to the index, that's typically what they did on the left-hand side, to find the reference to the page, where they would then cross out the poem, as you can see on the right-hand side, and then they go back to the index and cross out the entry in the index. So that's how they move back and forth. And finally, the index can be the name for a conventional figure of a hand with the forefinger extended, used in writing or printing to draw attention to a passage. In 1612, Brinsley wrote of the index in this sense as, quote, a hand pointing at some place which is of most necessary use. And Bill Sherman, whose wonderful book, Used Books, has come out recently from the University of Pennsylvania Press, and I have been over many years collecting lots and lots of examples of what are called by medieval scholars manicules, and they mean pointing fingers. So I'm just going to show you examples of this because they're so wonderful. So these are prosthetic fingers of different kinds, what I call prosthetic fingers, meaning they're the index finger as it leaves its trace behind in a book. In other words, one aspect of the word index, it mediates between the actual human body, your actual fingers, and the fingers then that you can draw into books, or why you have an index at the end of a book, it's actually directing you how to use your hand. one of the things that Bill has emphasized is how specific and often individual. Often it's hard to tell in the Middle Ages people's handwriting apart. You can often tell their manicules apart more easily than you can their handwriting. That often very specific people develop their own ways. And often they go to great trouble. It's one of the points that Bill emphasizes, is that it forces you to linger in the book. The actual drawing of the hands is a way of literally, in the most material sense, spending time around a passage. And some of these hands are very elaborate. Hands and fingers grow, and then they shrink. They stretch. They become obscene and do loop the loop and other such things. They stretch. This is from the Pseudo-Petrarch. This, by the way, is the first book here that was ever printed by women. So it was printed by nuns in the late 15th century. And the reader here is drawing attention to, has a lot about the female pope, Papa Femina, and the hand reaches up and femina, so it's a sort of, so these are arms that stretch and pick out particular passages. Fingers can multiply. I love that image. Fingers can sign. This is actually a movable hand I found in a German 16th century book. So someone's actually made this little hand. You can move it around, take it from place to place. These are the actual printers. They're called fists, which I think is a very bad word for them because they're not fists. They're pointing fingers. They were also called indexes, but they were normally called by printers fists, pointing to particular passages, and they can collapse after a long day's use. The Codex, as an emergent technology, enabled a reader to mark up places discontinuously. In this sense, the history of the Codex is the history of the bookmark. The first reference we have to what we would now call a book as opposed to a scroll, the first references are from Marshall in the 1st century of the Common Era, around about 84 to 86 of the Common Era. According to the statistics in the birth of the Codex, of the pagan literature, the pagan Greek literature that survives, there is only one codex from the 1st century of the Common Era. Yet by the 4th century, 73.5%, and by the 5th century, 89% of such pagan texts were codices, they were books. But the adoption of the Codex was by no means automatic among pagans, who continued to regard it as a culturally inferior form, as did St. Augustine. In contrast, the great majority of Christian texts, from as early as we have such texts, were already in the form of books. And only 14 of the surviving 172 Christian texts written before the 5th century were written on scrolls. Astonishingly, Christianity immediately adopted the Codex as its privileged form. By contrast, the Codex was only slowly adopted by pagans, and it tended to be treated as an inferior notebook form, even after it became the dominant technology. The most radical contrast, though, was not between Christians and pagans, both of whom converged in the use of the Codex by the 5th century. It was between Christians and Jews. Within Jewish culture, while codices may have been used as private notebooks, no Jewish codices have survived from before the 10th century in the Middle East and the 11th century in Europe. Prior to the 10th or 11th centuries, Christians and Jews actively differentiated themselves from each other through the adoption of the book or the scroll. The problem was to differentiate between the same. That is, Christians and Jews read the same Jewish scriptures. But whereas Jews read the scrolls of the Torah and of the prophets, Christians read the Bible, and that's, I think, a very specifically Christian word. The word Bible, by the way, originally just means papyrus, but it was adopted by Christians to mean, before Christians it was adopted to mean books because of the material substance, but the first use of the word Bible in the singular is remarkably late. Before that, it's a plural. It's a Latin neutral plural, meaning the books. So it's the books of Scripture, but it's only after they actually started binding together the Bible as a single book, long after St. Jerome, in other words, what these are called pandex, that it changed to being used as a feminine singular, the Bible in the singular. It mattered, in other words, between Jews and Christians, whether one read a scroll or a book. The difference between the Judaic scroll and the Christian Codex is curiously visualized in an engraving of the apocalyptic type in Joseph Mead's The Key to Revelation. This is a very typical 17th century book with a diagram to explain the whole history of the world. The end of the world is on the right-hand side, or on the vertical axis. And what it shows you at the top is the seventh seal. I hope you all know about the seventh seal from the great movie of that title, The Seventh Seal. So the seventh seal, you can see, is being undone at the top, and it goes down to the end of time on the right-hand side, then all the way around to the open book at the bottom. At the top of the engraving, there is a scroll with 7 seals. The emphasis is upon the scroll as a form that, through its seals, denies easy access. The emphasis is upon the scroll as a form that, through its seals, sorry, I said that, but the 7th seal loops around to the right, first to the end of time, the horizontal axis, and then back to a codex at the bottom of the engraving. The open book shows the suffering of martyrs on the verso with the header, "How long, O Lord, dost thou not avenge?" And on the recto, a quotation from Revelations chapter 5, verse 1, a book written within and on the backside, sealed with 7 seals. The closed scroll has been transformed into an open codex. But even more striking is what has happened to the seals that keep the scroll closed. They have been transformed into finding tabs. One finds these finding tabs particularly on a lot of late medieval and early Renaissance books, that will enable the reader to move easily from place to place. The Codex is thus marked not only by its openness, but by its bookmarks. It is represented as, above all, indexical, a technology that uses bookmarks like prosthetic fingers to take the reader easily from place to place. The only curious feature that I'd point out to you about this remains in certain ways, although it's obviously written in English, as you can see, it remains theoretically a Hebrew book. And the reason you know that is because of the page number. It's page 4 and page 5. So it actually keeps that notion of the opposite way of reading, even whilst it is actually written in English. The finger can itself be transformed into a bookmark, pointing to some other place in the Codex. Indeed, this use of the finger is, I believe, a characteristic of one iconographic tradition in the representation of St. Jerome. Petrus Christus depicts Jerome reading in his study, but this is about 1442, his book resting on a lectern on a table, the instruments of writing beside him. The index finger of his right hand marks the next opening, as if he is about to turn over the page, but his middle finger marks a place some 100 pages later. He is prepared to be in 3 places at once. And in Rembrandt's marvelous engraving of Jerome in the Wilderness, about 1653, much of the composition is taken up with his lion, a church, and other buildings, a tree, Jerome himself being pushed to the bottom left corner, a sketched seated figure against the densely worked lines of the tree. But his hand is made extraordinarily present in the dark shadows around it, a left hand holding a book. But he is reading typologically. As he reads in the New Testament, the middle finger of his hand marks a place in the Old Testament, creating a dark crevice in the book. Fingers as bookmarks. In a wonderful ironic reversal, Arcimboldo gives parchment bookmarks to his librarian as fingers. This is about 1566. The librarian's right arm is made up of 2 books. From the lower book project 4 parchment fingers. From the upper one, 2 bookmarks create a thumb. His parchment index finger is curled round to support another book. As a librarian, then, he holds a book, but he's also been transformed into the marking systems through which one reads a book discontinuously. As if his bookmark fingers were not enough, he wears a book hat upon his head. It is open in innumerable places, as if to conjure up a process of simultaneous reading, a Windows program in which pages 102, 104, 105, 106, 187, and 394 were all available simultaneously for inspection. And from the book hang 12 thread bookmarks attached to small beads or pearls. In a miniature of Jean Mielot, who died about 1472, the secretary to two dukes of Burgundy, and a famous translator and scribe, one can clearly see the material supports and the prosthetic fingers that transform the book into an indexical machine. So this is Jean Mielot. What you'll see is he's actually writing a scroll, curiously enough, that is lined up, but he is surrounded by books. And it's worth noting how he's made his fingers proliferate. And that's really what I want to focus upon here, just to show the range of ways in which his fingers have proliferated. What I mean by these prosthetic fingers, if these particular technologies didn't exist, he'd have to be using his finger to do something. So first of all, top left here, we're looking at this and this here. These are weights, which nowadays you virtually only find in rare book rooms. And it's just amazing we don't find them all over the place. They're immensely useful. So they're really practical. They enable him not to have to hold this book open. You can see it's trying to curl shut, but the weight keeps it open. So these are again, the first way in which he's actually proliferated his fingers. This book up here is marked up with bookmarks, you can see again. So he's got his fingers, his prosthetic fingers are in those different places there. This here is part of a marking system, as up there. These are inkhorns at the top. They're to hold 3 different colored inks. They'll be typically black, red, and blue. That would be the most normal 3 colors. And that's also an indexical system. It helps you to find rubrication. The whole point of rubrication is to find your place very easily, to find new sections. Down on the floor here, this book, the book strap that closes it has been turned round to actually mark a place within it. So you can see it turns back. Here, the book strap comes over to hold it shut, to hold it open, sorry, and then up there you can see there's a bookmark stuck in. So in other words, what he's done is proliferate a huge range of fingers to do all of these different things when his fingers, and they free him up to just be doing one thing, which is what he's doing, writing. If Jerome and the scholar scribe provide one model of the discontinuous reader, another model was organized around the Virgin Mary, whether at the Annunciation with Christ on her lap or enthroned in heaven. Look, for instance, at Hubert and Jan van Eyck's Ghent altarpiece, a much-studied painting. John the Baptist sits on the left of an enthroned Christ, a book on his lap. With his left hand, he has either just turned the page or is about to turn back. The bottom strap for closing the book marks a previous place. The strap itself is extended by a thread to which is attached a globe of small pearls with more individual pearls suspended like tassels. At the head of the book, and this is the crucial thing, is a larger globe of pearls. What we're looking at is this here. And these are painted again and again and again by Jan van Eyck. He painted them in extraordinary proliferation of these images. At the head of the book is a larger globe of pearls. This is the decorated end of a peep, a circular head of seed pearls to which multiple bookmarks are attached. Even in this poor reproduction, at least I don't know if you can, but I can just about, one can just about make out a black thread descending from the peep down to the right. John, in other words, is using 3 methods of marking different places in his Bible: his hand, the leather strap for closing the book, and a peep, an elaborate and expensive bookmarking system. To the right of Christ on the Ghent altarpiece, the Virgin sits reading. And here one can see the use of the peep more clearly. From it, 4 thin ribbons mark places to the left, 3 to the right. One of the places marked by a ribbon is also marked by the index finger of the Virgin's right hand. I count in all 17 of these bookmarks in the Ghent altarpiece. Of these, 6 show one or another kind of bookmark, and 3 have peeps, including a book behind the Virgin in the Annunciation scene on the outside of the shutters. Jan van Eyck again depicted a peep in the Annunciation in the National Gallery in Washington. There is, I believe, a typological reason for the ways in which John the Baptist and the Virgin mark their books. The Virgin marks the book with her right finger, rather than the left. That is, she marks forward in a Christian book. That is, she marks forward as if to see the future that has already been performed by the painting itself. A Christ dead, resurrected, and now enthroned in heaven. The three figures of John the Baptist, Christ in Majesty, and the Virgin thus bring together three different temporalities and as three moments of reading. John shows the past that has led to this present. That's why he's marking with his left-hand finger. So John shows the past that has led to this present. Mary shows how the present of the Annunciation, depicted in the closed shutters of the altarpiece, is shadowed by future death. God in majesty in the middle fulfills the prophecy of his own resurrection and triumph. The typological relation of prophecy and fulfillment, which is inscribed in the actively discontinuous structure of the Christian Bible, finds its visual materialization in the Ghent altarpiece. And the proliferation of prosthetic fingers in the form of bookmarks reveals the book as an indexical machine. And my final section is called Cutting Up Scrolls, Indexical Reading. Perhaps the most persistent myth about reading today is that the book as a technological form is organized so as to be read from page 1 to page 2, from page 2 to page 3, and so on, from beginning to end. This is, of course, a possible way of reading a book, and one that was encouraged by the development of narrative fiction in the 18th century. The highest compliment to be paid to a story within this paradigm is that it is a page-turner, a language machine in which the text itself seems to perform as a perpetual motion device, turning its own successive pages. In a page-turner, the teleological drive from page to page mitigates against dipping about or turning back, although not, in the case of the unbearable suspense of a mystery, from skipping forward to find out who did it. When cultural critics nostalgically recall an imagined past in which readers unscrolled their books continuously from beginning to end, they are actually reversing the long history of the Codex and the printed book as indexical forms. The novel has only been a brilliantly perverse interlude in the long history of discontinuous reading. For the Codex was a radical subversion of the technology of the scroll, encouraging the cutting up of a text by the reader into multiple sound bites that he or she could rapidly move between. Such random access for specific ends, to learn all that one can about the common loon, for instance, is now enabled by ever more powerful search engines, which look through the web for you. Yet my Macintosh computer still uses a little hand to travel around the screen and a pointing finger. And when I find a new website, I add a bookmark, which on my old computer was visualized nostalgically at the top of the screen as a blue silk ribbon. The navigation of computers is still imagined in the visual language that was elaborated in the 15th century for the navigation of books, the language of the index finger and of its prosthetic form, the bookmark. Thank you. And I'm very happy to take questions, so I've got questions. Yeah.
I'm curious about scrolls. And you were talking about how in the late antique period, for pagan readers, scrolls remained high status. And was that just nostalgia, or was there a specific reading function that they valued over this kind of simultaneity that the Codex allowed?
That's a really, really good question. I'm not sure I've got a good answer to it. I think that, first of all, there's enormous emphasis in classical antiquity upon mnemonic techniques. So it's not to say that you're determined by the scroll form if you've memorized a text. And that's true within the rabbinic tradition too. So in some ways what I'm looking at, I'd say, is a kind of fantasy that Christians had by mapping the Codex onto what they did, as if Jews only read the Torah, which of course they didn't. They actually had elaborate mnemonic techniques to leap from place to place. I think that, I mean, the main point, though, I'd say, is about mnemonic techniques. In other words, that what the Codex enables is what people, it's not that there's a novel practice in that sense. People have already trained themselves in very elaborate ways to move rapidly back and forth between different parts, but through mnemonic techniques. What the book form allows you to do, which becomes dominant, of course, within the Christian liturgy, is to actually have a single book in which you actually read one passage from the Old Testament, one passage from the Gospels, one passage from the Pauline epistles in a single book. And what you do is you bookmark it ahead of time, those passages, and just turn, to those pages. And try to imagine doing that with a scroll, and you see what the problems are. First of all, you couldn't possibly have a scroll that size. The Torah is a totally, there's nothing like the Torah in classical antiquity. The size of it is immense. And that's only 5 books, right? You're only dealing with the Pentateuch for the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. So for me, one of the interesting differences between Christianity and Judaism is that now many Jews today talk about the Bible, but still, I would actually want to make a distinction that the Bible, for me, is very much a Christian concept, that the Torah, the way Jews came to divide up their scriptures into 3 parts, but the Torah is the only one that's unified as a single object. In other words, the Torah and the other scrolls are separate scrolls. And so that you're moving between, the book of Isaiah would be a scroll, which is actually described in the New Testament, that Christ goes into the temple and reads from the book of Isaiah, but it means the scroll. He actually takes the scroll and reads from that. So the question of the order of scriptures is very problematic within Judaism. And there's literally immense debates. What's the order? Once you've got a Bible, a Codex, the order is crucial. And one of the most peculiar features of the ordering process is that for Jerome, the end of the Bible was not the book of Revelation, it was the Pauline epistles. And so actually there's an interesting shift to make, but now we take it for granted that Revelation, within that framework, it looks like Genesis is the Alpha, Revelation's the Omega. But no, these things, but once it gets established, there's an order. It takes a long time to really do that. So these things aren't automatic. There are debates about them, but still there will be a sort of, so I think it makes a very big difference to the question of ordering processes, the actual material artifact of what we call Pandex, these great big Bibles that had the whole thing in, the whole Christian thing in, I should say, yeah. Yes?
That was great, thank you. And so I guess partly what you're telling us is that the panic about the death of the book is really a panic about the death of the scroll.
Yes. Exactly, which we should have gone over a very long time ago, right?
Right, which makes complete sense. But then I'm wondering, is it really the novel? Is really the novel when we started to misrecognize books as scroll-like? My real question, though, I guess, is so I have a bunch of related questions, right?
Yeah.
Is where this distinction breaks down, right? Because in some ways, I really like you're absolutely, your dad, so my version of this is, I'm worried that my children won't watch movies in their entirety, but will just click through the chapters that they like, right?
Right.
I'm worried that they won't read also, but
Yeah.
when I realized that, I could write community grants about the power of children watching feature films, I thought this is really something. So I'm wondering. It seems to me that when we worry about the death of the book, we're worried about the sort of continuous, extended engagement in reading practice, right? And so I'm wondering if when, these fabulous pictures with all the fingers, do you see evidence simultaneously of what you're calling kind of indexical fingery reading, and also something that we would read as continuous?
Yeah.
And where does the distinction seems really helpful, but it also seems like it makes me just really, I think I still am nervous about the end of the scroll.
Yes, okay. No, it's excellent. That's an excellent point. Yeah, you're completely right. I should say that there certainly was a tradition of reading in certain ways continuously within both the Christian as well as the Jewish tradition. To take one example, within the Church of England, for instance, you supposedly read the Psalms every month, the book of Psalms, so 12 times a year, but you read it in sequence, literally, from Psalm 1, Psalm 2, Psalm 3, and so on. So there you'd have there is also a tradition of trying to get through the Bible in the whole year, and that has a sort of certain continuity to it in that way. Nonetheless, I'd say that the dominant practice is this discontinuous thing. The whole crucial thing is actually not to read forwards, to actually read back and forth. And I think to that extent, I do think it's a mistake to think of the book form as a good form for continuity. And I think you can think of this when you realize how wonderful for continuity a film is. When you go to the cinema, you have no control. I was talking to David about it. And what I love about films is the pure, delicious masochism. You sit there, and this thing happens to you. It unwinds at its fixed speed. You have no control over this. And it's difficult to imagine anything less like a book than that. You know, you can pick up a book, you can flick through, you can. So I do think that many of us worry about reading, but I think that we're wrong to think that what we're really worrying about there is the history of our own reading, that once upon a time there were novels and people aren't reading novels anymore. So people are often talking about novels and fictions like that. An interesting counterexample is that Samuel Richardson, who wrote the best-selling book of the 18th century, Pamela, was worried about the opposite. He was worried that people would read continuously. That was his worry. And what he did was he took all of his novels and turned them into a commonplace book, literally organized under A to Z. So they're the topic headings, like, what does Pamela think about, affection? What does she think under A? And it's literally, they're sound bites. That's what he thinks is really great about his book. It's got these great sound bites. And he's worried that people are going to get just absorbed. So a lot of the attack upon fiction historically has been that it absorbs people. That's why it's dangerous, that people just submit to it, rather than doing this much more active kind of reading, which the book encourages. So there I would say, I think, that we're often, nostalgically remembering something. Doesn't mean we're necessarily wrong to be nostalgic. We may, those are choices we have to make. Do we want to train people in novel reading? Is that what we should be doing? But I think we should be aware of the fact that novel reading this has a quite short history, and that people were very suspicious of it, in fact, when it emerged. It seemed to be a very, very odd kind of activity. I don't know if that answers your question. I hope so, a bit. Yeah, David.
So I think I'm hearing you say two things, and I want to check and see if I'm getting it. First is that discontinuous reading is not necessarily discontinuous, but not extended, that there can be extended discontinuous reading. They're not the same thing. And the second is that there's a kind of, I don't know, you could call it a politics of these different forms of reading, where discontinuous reading is a way of asserting one's control over the material read. So that this is one reason that the Hebrew Scriptures get subordinated to the New Testament through indexical reading, is because it's a way of asserting the priority of one system over another. And we do the same thing. When I teach a novel, first time I read it as a page turner and sort of let myself go to it. But when I go back to write my lecture on it, then I've got to impose something on it. So that's when I get all digital about turning the pages.
Absolutely. I mean, I think education, you can see that very much with movies. I mean, really, if you tried to teach a movie in the era of the scroll, as I actually did, I mean, it's difficult to remember that, but first we had to be, it was incredibly tiring, literally physically tiring. You had to lug around a 60mm projector. So the first thing you actually have to carry a projector with you, which is no mean task. You had to go through the scroll the night before and put pieces of paper which mark the place. And then you sit in the class and you wind through to find the place. Because teaching, we do not consider it teaching to show a film. That's not called teaching, right? That teaching actually requires that discontinuity. And so it requires a notion. So if I just showed the film in class, I'd have been fired, I guess. I don't know. I gave up on it. I just thought, I didn't want to spend my life lugging around 60mm projectors, And I thought, you've got this incredibly advanced technology. You suddenly saw that the Bible was the most advanced technology. It's divided up by book, chapter, and verse. People have different copies of the Bible. It doesn't matter. You can find the place with incredible rapidity. So as a classroom device, that's pretty superb. And of course, that's what happens as anything becomes a classic. Shakespeare, you divide up. Almost the sign of a classic is the moment which you actually divide up into into chunks that you can retrieve so that you can actually discuss it and have scholarly discourse about it.
I don't know if I really believe this, but it sounds like you could say, okay, then discontinuous reading is empowering. And what we really get nervous about with our kids is not that they aren't reading, but that they're making their own decisions about where to go, rather than submitting themselves to the logic of the artifact that they're reading.
But I think you're both saying that we think that, well, I think, right, that my own nostalgia for good, thorough reading is both, right? You have to read the whole thing, and you have to, you have to actually, and I think the fear, right, is that you just skip around, right? You just Google for your book report, right? You don't actually read a whole, read a whole thought about something, that you just kind of pick and choose, but which is different than you study the whole thing and you break it down, which is what scholars are really good at, right? We look at the whole and then we stick our post-it notes in it, we write a paper about it, we chop it all up. But it seems like we do both. We kind of assume that both of those things have to go.
But only for certain books. I mean, I want to stress that, that no one in their right minds reads academic books that way. We all rip each other's books apart. We go to the index. I buy David's book. I'm not going to read it from page 1 to page. No one does it to my books. I mean, it would be ludicrous. What we do is you're teaching a class on Hamlet. You look at your book. You look at the index. You find the passage on Hamlet. So you've got a whole book by Stephen Greenblatt that's about God knows what. Forget it. Life is short. Books are very long. Books are very long. So, one of the things I think we talk very mythically about our own reading practices, and we need to separate out the range of reading practices we use. And in some ways, I'd have to say I'm using a very crude opposition here between continuous and discontinuous. There are lots of different kinds of discontinuous reading, so each thing needs to be broken down much further. But I certainly think that, I'm embarrassed when I look through the books. I have a huge number of books. And I pull a book down on the shelf. What I've nearly always done, when I buy the book, I've looked at the preface. I've looked at the acknowledgements. I always like to know, who gets acknowledged and who doesn't get acknowledged. And I've nearly always read the conclusion, right? But in between, and, if I'm working on a particular topic like shoes, then I find embarrassingly in some of my books, in the margin, shoes, and discontinuously across, I've been skipping as fast as I can just to get rid of all the stuff that's about, hats. I don't want hats, I want shoes, so you're sort of, and so it seems to me that we often read in highly motivated ways, and we need to talk. And many books, of course, are designed to be read in motivated ways. I mean, a phone book, obviously, that's what you're trying to find the telephone number you want. You're not trying to read through the whole thing. Or a car manual, when something goes wrong. I do want to sort of stress that I think that what the book as a form has been, as a technology has been great for, is for this kind of ability to find what you want, which is like a computer. And I do think, as I say, I think that computers take that to the nth degree. What they've been having more problems with is the scroll function. And that's what books are great at, because you're right what you said to begin with. You can always treat a book as a scroll. You always could. I should say that. Anyone, if they wanted, and we have evidence that some people did. Some people did actually sit down and read the Bible from beginning to end. But it certainly wasn't the dominant practice. The liturgical practice, which is dominant, works very much against that. You shouldn't do that. Yeah.
Yeah, just to kind of pick up on Susan's point and what you're saying, it seems like these very interesting moments are the moments when you're going from film that's a scroll to a digitized kind of thing. And it's at that moment that this becomes, and so I was also thinking about plays that are sort of Shakespeare that's staged, and then the way in which you've got more and more publications coming out, and say with Johnson's folio, and then quarto publications, but then what happens when suddenly you have folio publications and then Shakespeare's complete works, and how that works into a kind of almost a sacredness in a sense and allows for a different kind of interpretation.
Absolutely, but one of the myths, as we all know, of buying complete, even if you buy a complete work, very, very few Shakespeareans ever read it that way. I mean, it would be almost unimaginable, I think, to start at the beginning and read through. And normally what you do is that you buy your complete works because it's useful for reference purposes. And then if it's a book, if there's one of the plays you're particularly interested in, you buy a good edition, quotation marks, a good edition, meaning the Arden edition or whatever, and you do something with good footnotes, much better than footnotes than your complete works has. And I take it it's the same for Chaucerians, that they do the same thing, that you can actually often get these, something just on the Wife of Bath's Tale, which has a very good introduction and good, commentaries and debates and so on. But you still have the Riverside Chaucer as a sort of reference point. But what's interesting is that we tell ourselves these myths about how we read, which when you look at our bookshelves, you'd see if you're like me, because I underline everything, to a crazy degree, you'd see that I virtually never read continuously. I mean, the only ones I read continuously are revealed by the fact there are no underlinings in them. I've been reading a novel, for instance, when I came here on the plane, and that I haven't underlined. But the reason I haven't underlined it is I'm fairly sure I'm not going to teach it. And that if I thought, even I went through a period where I was reading James Bond, but because I was doing cultural studies at that point, I knew I was going to teach James Bond. So it was heavily underlined. It had all these sort of crucial points, about James Bond on golf in Goldfinger, And there the question is, why? Why do you get golf in Goldfinger? A whole chapter on golf, which is the most boring, for me, the most boring game in the world. I just couldn't understand it. But, it's very much part of that world. But that's what I was getting at, is that marking up itself is part of that process. Yeah, yeah.
I just have a comment for Susan and David about the book as scroll. You know the Codex Sinaiticus, which is a very early copy of the Gospel. What's written in 4 columns on each page, which is just unparalleled.
Absolutely.
And when you open it up, it actually is the full opening of a scroll. You're meant to perceive it as a scroll, so that it's you turn the pages, but it's like unrolling it. So that really is the book as scroll. Because it was conceived as an object. And then I guess my question is, I've got 2 questions. The first one is, so do you think the difference between the Codex and the scroll really plays into the mythology of the Christian text as contemplative, as research-oriented, as a place where you look at the Old Testament, the New Testament, this specific passage in Mark and Matthew, and then a reflex in John? You've got the whole Eusebian canon tables. You're really meant to compare and contemplate. Whereas Virgil is just something you memorize and parade.
I do.
That the Christian text really, the innovation was the Christian attitude towards the interpretation of their master text.
Right.
And that you dipped into it as an act of, reverence, but of real scholarship too. And it's not the same thing for the scroll when you're looking at...
No, it's an excellent question. I mean, do I buy... I mean, yes, I do buy into them. I think you're right, there's a mythical aspect to it, but I buy into it in the sense that I think it comes true. In other words, I think that what's going to happen is that eventually the Talmud will become, from the 11th century, 12th century onwards, the Talmud becomes a book too. So the book form comes to be this notion. I mean, where there's a bad sense of myth about it is the fantasy that Jews actually were reading consecutively. That's a myth. It was the notion that all Jews read the Torah. And it was one of the reasons of the massive hatred for the Talmud. The Torah there was never such animosity directed against the Torah. I mean, they couldn't do anyway because it's part of the Christian scriptures, but it's the Talmud that takes the burden. But the reason why the Talmud was so obnoxious to so many Christians was both because it has attacks upon Christianity within it, but it's not just that. It's really that it's too similar. It shows that, that there's a very, very similar kind of practice of reading going on within Judaism, and might reveal that Christian reading practices are actually fundamentally Judaic, which they were. They were part of an oral tradition. They were part of an oral tradition of discontinuity, which was very, very thoroughly worked out and very elaborate. It doesn't alter the fact that once you've got the book form, it does enable non-experts, all sorts of people, to do this flicking about, moving back and forth. So Mary Rowlandson, will actually do the sortes Virgilianae. She'll just literally open random places and find what it says and stab in there. Bunyan does this. But so there's all sorts of things you can do once you've got a codex that really make for a whole range of different, reading practices, many of which will get picked up. So I do think it makes, but I think your main point is an excellent one. But I would stress the very things that you talked about, that very early, they didn't have Christian Bibles to begin with, I should say that. I mean, the Pandect, they didn't have the binding technology. It took a while to do that. But what they did have from very early was they bound together the 4 Gospels, 4 versions of the same story with the Eusebian canon table. And that's about comparing and contrasting. It's not about continuing. You're not meant to read even the Gospels through. You're actually saying, here's how it appears in Matthew, here's how it appears in Mark, so it's like, and I take that to be very significant. And then also, so that's one practice, that's a very scholarly practice perhaps, but then there's also just the typology that's part of the church service. And that's, for me, sort of more basic in a way, the typology that just gets organized into the church service, so that you expect there to be, within Catholicism, it changes somewhat within certain Protestant sects, but you expect there to be a relationship at any service. Like the 1st of January, which is the Feast of the Circumcision. You read about, the circumcision of Abraham, and then you read about the fact that St. Paul says you need to circumcise your heart. That's what you do. So you just read those 2 passages against each other. Yeah.
This is to follow up on a couple of things people have said, but I wonder, and you kind of went this way a little bit at the end of your talk. Listening to you, it sounds like partly what you're talking about here is a kind of triumph over time in terms of the Christian Bible's Codex, insofar as you've got a book that basically, and your picture of the Virgin, which just disappeared, has a kind of rendering of time in total, but then that can all be simultaneous by a discontinuous, as you're describing it, kind of model of reading. So, I mean, I was wondering, like, why is it continuous versus discontinuous in that way? Because what you've got is this kind of comprehensiveness of time, but it doesn't necessarily need to be linear at the same time. It can be kind of simultaneous around the same, so that several events can speak to one another at once.
Absolutely. I mean, there has to be an element of temporality. Even within Christianity, the crucial temporal element, of course, is Christ. That's the crucial temporal element, namely that there's history before Christ from a Christian perspective and history afterwards. And so typology requires there to be at one level of before and after. But the before and after is extremely complicated because what type literally means, I mean, it comes from classical, it's what you do with a seal. It's the stamp that you make. So it's a stamp that leaves its impression. And the way I would read typology is to say, with a sort of rigorously, from my perspective, what I would imagine as a rigorously theological perspective is to say, because Christ, within a Christian perspective, is from all time, he has actually already stamped the Old Testament. So the Old Testament is Christianity in reverse image, because when you make a stamp, it's reversed. And then it's put the right way around in the New Testament. So the question of before, after is complicated by that very fact in certain ways. But the question of simultaneity is that you're absolutely right. Of course, that's part of the argument being made here, is that all this is simultaneous on the one hand, and yet also has to be lived temporally, has to be lived through time. But also, of course, you could find those very self-same tensions within Judaism. So that the notion of the Torah is very much about, I mean, Exodus is about, the actual journey, so that aspect. And one aspect of the Torah, of the physical motion of turning the Torah, is reproducing that literal journey. It's a journey that you're making with your hands that was made with feet before. But the whole question of prophecy, which is quite different. The question of prophecy is itself about this simultaneity. It's about that one moment in time, you're dealing with a different moment of time, and they collapse onto each other. So there's going to be that tension, I'd say, in all of these traditions. The question is more of emphasis. And so the real thing I was trying to emphasize more is this notion of simultaneity, as you just said, and as against that notion of continuous reading, which does seem to me, by and large, to be marginalized within Christianity. It's not there, but it's marginalized. It's not the main focus. It's not the main focus of visual culture either. Visual culture is often about these typologies, bringing together different moments into a single image. Yeah.
So on the visual culture question, can you pull up your last slide?
Yes.
As you were showing your pictures, I was thinking about the iconography of index fingers, and in the film world, of course, they're called trigger fingers. So
just one sec. Is this the slide you meant?
It is, because as you were showing us all these pictures of index fingers, I was thinking, I never really paid attention to index fingers while I was looking at these pictures. And then I was thinking, what were they? And then we got to this slide, and I remembered that I was thinking, aren't usually like the saints pointing up to the heavens or something like that? That's what we usually do with index fingers, but I couldn't remember. So as you were showing them, I was thinking, well, could you tell us what the iconography for index fingers was when they're not stuck in books? But then I looked at this slide, which was the last one, where you actually have that index finger stuck up in the sky. Yeah. And that thing, those halos, are like scrolls. So I'm sort of curious if you think that's deliberate or not.
Oh, you mean about the halos as?
There's words all around them. There's scrolls, and
that's really interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. I actually don't think that he's not pointing at this. He's pointing at God, who's
not what they used to do with those
who's in between them. It may be both. If you go back, I don't know what I say. I'm trying to think. Let's see if I can go back to it. I think that you see the situation. I think, but it's not to say it's not, but the main point you're making is, I think, extremely interesting, is that, first of all, that you find scrolls all over Christianity. Then it's not that they disappear, they don't. And one of the most interesting tensions there is there's an amazing painting, which I've always much liked, in Siena, in the town hall there, which shows the evangelists with scrolls, and their scrolls unfold from their hands, and they're written in Hebrew. But the painter was a Christian, didn't know any Hebrew, so what it says is A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You know, it's just the alphabet. They just call it. But then you have the church fathers writing into books, and this notion that there's always a sort of temporal idea that gets mapped onto this, often of a movement from scroll to codex. The far more typical thing, which is in a wonderful painting so the notion of this tension of actually having the scrolls within the painting is actually very common, I should say that, and it's very common within Christianity. And that, I forget which one of there's a whole family of Crivellis, but there's a painting by Crivelli in Philadelphia. And there, one of the saints has what's called an orphrey. It's this sort of very decorative collar. It has all of the Jewish prophets. Every one of them has a scroll. And then another of the saints has an orphrey. It has the Christian apostles. Every one of them has a book. And the exception is John the Baptist, going around the back, he has a scroll. And it's because he comes before. So literally the moment of the transition from Judaism to Christianity is explicitly marked there as a transition from scroll to book. So there's a tension between them. Yeah. Yes?
All right, well, let me drag you to the future.
Yes.
All right, if indices and footnotes are scholarly collaborations, and the real reason that there's indications of places in text is to draw attention to that place, either for yourself or for your scholarly collaboration, right?
Right.
Okay, so I've got this huge collection of people's thoughts and markings of places that I'm supposed to pay attention to, or I want to pay attention to, and it takes up rooms and rooms and rooms, except that my scholarly life is very mobile, and I can't drag my scholarly work around with me all the time. So Clifford Lynch and Brewster Kahle and I have had an ongoing discussion for about the last 10 years of the networked book and the personal digital library, which would allow you to take these indices and points, and with the technology of digital computers, be able to actually create these collaborative workatoriums, or you know, whatever you want to call them.
Yep.
And be able to carry that with you, not to replace that original artifact or that original piece, but to continue that discussion on the go. And I'm just curious, what do you think about that?
I think it's fabulous. I mean, one of the things I think that's been completely mystified is this whole argument about what's the relation between computers and books. And to see this competitive relationships just strikes me as absolutely bizarre. To just say the most obvious thing, I mean, Penn, we now have this wonderful website called SETI, S-C-E-T-I, the Schoenberg Center for Electronic Text and Image. And it has, you know, we have the whole of the first folio in beautiful magnified images. It's really fantastic, the quality. And the more people look at these, the more they come to the library, the more they actually work on the books. And this is a sort of no-brainer. So the first thing to say is that seems to be an argument that should have died years ago. You know, the notion that necessarily there's a bad relationship, which isn't to say that, coming back to the other question, that of course we're fully aware of the fact that many people grow up today who actually virtually never deal with books at all. But that's a different question, it seems to me. I think they need to be separated from each other. So that what's happening, certainly in my experience, is the higher tech we're getting, the better, you know, these images, the more interesting the websites are, the more people are actually seeing how they can go about doing research in rare book libraries. And so what we're seeing is rare book libraries are getting fuller and fuller and fuller. You know, in a sense, it's a total drag. You know, you go to the British Library now, and it's hard to find a seat. You know, you want to say in the good old days, no one used to go. You know, the only people used to go were sort of, you know, I was actually chosen to go by a fringe left group, which I belong to, which is to occupy Karl Marx's seat in the British Library, you know, against all the other fringe left groups. You know, but that was, you know, But now, you know, people actually go there, they read and things. It's kind of quite distressing. And, you know, so I actually think in certain ways we're seeing almost the opposite. You know, I think we're seeing a huge expansion of scholarship. Another area you're seeing a massive expansion of scholarship, in my view, is Wikipedia. I'm a huge fan of Wikipedia. And I think that it's coming from mainly from two groups. And I think it's very interesting, both groups. They're the two groups. I may be wrong about this, but certainly my strong impression in certain areas is of teenagers and younger, particularly around movies, music, things like that. So people who aren't yet in higher education. And then from people who actually are retired. And so a lot of my friends who've retired, they spend a lot of time writing for Wikipedia. That's what they do with entries. So two groups marginalized from the educational establishment, you know, which are by age, by being too old or too young, seem to me to be taking over and doing phenomenal things. Nancy Vickers, who was president of Bryn Mawr, works on Petrarch and Dante, but she also works on rock video, because she loves rock video. And you know, one of the things she says is that academic scholarship in this area is appalling, because any fan would know, you know, how full of errors, just grotesque errors academics are, because they're not fans. You know, they say things about this, they'll say things about the backup singer, they've got the wrong person, they'll say things about, you know, and so when Nancy started working this, what she tried to do is get in touch with the fans and find out what they say. So that Sisters Are Doing It For Themselves, that video they did, which was, who was it? Sisters Are Doing It For Themselves, Annie Lennox and... Anyway, the two singers were never in the same place. All it required was someone to actually follow their timetables. So it was created. You know, it's a fictional meeting of sisters doing it for themselves. The sisters actually weren't together. They were, but it was, you know, it was an electronic meeting rather than. But it's made into a real meeting in the actual video. You see them singing it together. So I think that, you know, all of this, what I'm basically saying is I think the electronic age is democratizing scholarship in various ways, and also taking away some of the mystery of it, that there's lots out there that's just plain wrong. And the high position is that we should be policing what's wrong. We're the people who are wrong half the time. You know, it's the, say, we're actually getting scholarship coming from these people who actually know we're wrong. And so part of why academics are really threatened by Wikipedia is, you know, you know, you bet.
One other observation, that is that we do a lot of early childhood literacy and we watch children read. And when you see them first pick up books like K through 4, and they're seeing a new book for the first time, guess what they do? They turn to the end.
Yeah.
You know, is this worth my time? Is this going to be a good ending? I don't know what they're thinking. We haven't gotten that far yet.
Yeah.
But they'll tell stories about why they turn to the end.
Yeah.
When they first pick up a new book.
Yeah.
So that's pretty
Yeah.
cool. And they use their fingers a bunch.
Yes. And of course they can use them because they've got pop-ups. I mean, children's books are so much more inventive than adult books. You know, you've got all these things that you can pull up and, you know, uncover and so on. So it really, they're great.
Could I make a suggestion? We've got some refreshments for all of you behind the back wall for you to run around, and we can keep talking. But let's thank Peter for a wonderful talk.